Our reading today is from Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 45. And as Jeff and I were saying, just make sure to listen for the last verse. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyards to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that Jesus was speaking about them.
Another good parable. There is so much in this parable that is so tricky. And I'm not sure that I can expose all the things that are in this parable. I think so much depends on the listener and the context and who is speaking to who and who is answering questions. Any of you remember the Bob Dylan song "All Along the Watchtower"? And then Jimi Hendrix made a version of it. So Bob Dylan actually has a lot of biblical references in his songs, and "All Along the Watchtower" refers to the watchtower in the first part of this song, or this section of Matthew. Also, the Jehovah's Witness have a magazine that they pass out, and it's called The Watchtower. And actually, Jesus borrowed this story from another telling of this parable that's in the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody know where that is? I had to go back and find it. I knew that it was there. It's in Isaiah. Let me read you a bit of the retelling of the parable in Isaiah, because it has to do with that very last part of what is written in Matthew that says the chief priests and Pharisees knew that the parable was about them. Okay? So from Isaiah chapter 5, "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. No more rain will fall upon it. For the vineyard is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. Ah, you who join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. So, if the chief priests and Pharisees know that this parable is about them, it has maybe a slightly different meaning than the traditional interpretation, which is that God is the landowner, the people rejected his son, and so on. I think it's also worth noting that if you think of the chief priests and the Pharisees, I want you to know that I consider that to be me. Okay? In other words, me in my role here is somewhat like the chief priests and Pharisees in a way that I would like to explain. And another thing that I want to I'm sort of building up to what I really want to say by giving you this context. So often when we look at the Bible, if we see it as sacred scripture, we see it as an ending point. But really, it's just a beginning point. In other words, it's not something that we go, or at least it's not something that I go to get a final word on something. It's something that I go to help point me to a place where I get a different understanding for myself, for my own transformation. And I consider the Bible to be sacred, but not because it's a reliable version of the truth. That may seem contradictory, but that's just the way I see it. And I think if you listen to me enough over time, you'll see what I mean by that. It's kind of hard to explain in just one 20-minute sermon that might last 30 minutes. I'm not sure. We'll see. But anyhow, so I just want to keep that in mind, that what we're looking at in the text is not the final word, okay? And it is so important, I think, to think, who is Jesus speaking to when he tells the parable? Sometimes he says the parable to the disciples. Sometimes he's preaching to sort of an unknown crowd or a group of people around him. Sometimes he might be preaching or teaching in a way that is meant to be overheard, as in this case, where the chief priests and Pharisees knew that he was speaking about them. So how could he be speaking about them? Well, I want to first talk about modern business management, because what we have is an absent landlord. Okay? Now, in this parable, this landlord is results oriented, right? Meaning he wants his portion of the harvest. Okay? He's not process oriented. He just turned it over. And he's certainly not relational, because he made no visit to the vineyard during the whole time that it was growing or getting ready to produce. So from the old management by walking around and being present and process oriented, this is a disaster. Any good management consultant would have told you that this isn't going to work, because there's no relationship between the people that are working and the result that they're trying to produce, and something being good for everybody, all the stakeholders involved, right? I mean, isn't that what happens when you have property and you leave it untended? our concept of property here is so interesting when I think about Stelli's family in Nicaragua. They have people in Nicaragua called tomatilleros, land takers. If your land is sitting there and vacant and you don't do anything to show ownership and you're gone for a long time, you could come back later and somebody's built a house on it and it's not your land anymore. And you have to go through a lot of trouble to get it back. And in the recent trouble that they had in Nicaragua, the people that disagreed with Daniel Ortega, the president, he had a group of people called the tomatilleros. And he would just say, point his finger to the people that gave him a problem, and they would go and sit on their land and take it. So this idea of what's happening in this story sort of plays into that idea of being absent and of being untended. And that is why the parable is about the chief priests and Pharisees. Because in what I read to you from Isaiah, what Jesus is saying is the people haven't been cared for. You've been so absent that it's become lawless and unjust. There's killing going on. There's things happening on the land where there's no respect for anybody that comes into the territory. All of the things that you could have done to cultivate this land, to cultivate these relationships, to cultivate a way of having something in common with these people, to have a harvest that could be shared, has been ignored. So in a way, Jesus is not talking about the people on the land that are unruly. He's talking about the people that oversee the land, oversee the spiritual care of the people. Because when you talk to people and you care for them and you're relational to them, it's very hard for them to do you harm. That was sort of one of the principles I used with the boyfriends that my daughters brought home. I always made sure that I talked to them, let them know who I was, made friends with them, found out who their parents were, talked to their parents, and I didn't have a lot of problems. Not because I was intimidating. I hope. At least I didn't intend it to be intimidating. I actually did care for them because I care for my daughters. So if you were to look at this story, maybe what we should do is we should say, use the three principles that I just talked about in reverse order. Meaning, instead of starting with results or maybe even thinking about process and then wondering why your relationships are no good, maybe you start with relationships before you do anything. That you care for the people that you're going to do business with. The things that you want to do together where you're looking for a good outcome, maybe you don't even talk about the outcome until the relationships are already solid and good. And then you have a good process. So that whatever you're trying to do, you make sure that you follow that process, not because you're trying to, drill in a certain procedure or anything like that, but simply because you want to make sure all your bases are covered. When I say bases are covered, I'm talking about making sure everybody's had a chance to be heard, making sure everybody knows where you are in the process, making sure that everybody has a chance to say what they want to say, and taking the time to listen. And sometimes I think when you have a really good process, you have to go slow in order to go fast. Because what happens is when you skip those early steps, sometimes what happens is things get all gnarled up and you have to go back and fix what you didn't take care of the first time before you can move on. And then after you've done all of that kind of work, then you can start thinking about the results. Then you get the feedback that says, have we done a good job? Have we been caring for each other? Have we done all of the things that are required to do this kind of work, whatever it is? And of course, here in Ladera Community Church, we're trying to do work that is inspired and spiritual, that's socially just, that carries with it the mark of care. So really, this parable is kind of about us too. But I feel and I place the burden of that process and those relationships on myself. Because if I didn't remind you of those things, if I didn't take the time to be with you in the ways that I need to be with you as your pastor, it would be silly for me to expect that there would be a good outcome. Because part of the outcome is not what we do, but what each of us become. So what I said last week about can we state what we're doing in terms of our own transformation as human beings? Can we think about what we're doing about anything we do as a community and how it transforms or what the impact is on those that we're doing it for? All of these things are part of what I would call a certain kind of spiritual maturity, where we understand our impact and what we do, not our intention. Our intention is important, but if we do, and we always fall back on our intention and we don't pay any attention to our impact, we're not really caring. So our spiritual maturity is tied to understanding that impact of everything that we do. And then there's one more thing to consider. It's easy to overlook that very last part of the parable where Jesus asks, what is the landowner going to do? Now, why would he ask a question like that? I think there's a very good reason for asking that kind of question in his place and time, and maybe even in our place and time, because his life was potentially in danger. So for him to ask that question, what he's really trying to do is not so much answer the parable, because I don't think that would be his answer. But the answer that is said from the people who are listening is that the people that have tended the land will be punished. And so Jesus immediately knows the mindset of the people that he's speaking to. He suddenly knows their context. And when you think of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what you need to think of sometimes is, okay, who are these people and what's happening in their context? Because the Sadducees, they're sort of like what you would call literalists, meaning they believed in the written Torah. The Pharisees were the ones that believed in the prophetic tradition and the writings and the extra literature that was arising out of the written Torah, the oral tradition. They had that. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees did. And here's some really important points. The Sadducees believed that their world should be Hellenized, meaning that they should be assimilated into the Roman Empire. The Pharisees were separatists. They didn't believe in being assimilated into the occupying power. So where does that leave Jesus? So you can see how marginalized he was. He wasn't part of the governing group. He wasn't part of the separatists. He was speaking to both of them. So it makes sense that he would ask a question about that. And it would make sense that if he was speaking from a parable in Isaiah, that he was talking to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the ones that heard the prophetic tradition. Isaiah the prophet. So we see that he's actually very clever in a way. He's telling people that if you're not relational, that if you don't care for what's going on, if you leave something and you're an absentee landlord that has nothing but a desire for the results without what's going on between when you start and when the results come, you're likely to get a mess. And who's at fault when you have a mess? Well, the people that are in charge are in fault, not the workers, not the people that have been left on their own, not the ones that have been left without any guidance or any help along the way. So I told you that I'm the Pharisee, chief priest, I guess, in a way. So when I talk to you about what we do as a church, I hope you understand that I'm trying for us, and I said this very early when I came here, and I know that just as I'm starting to get you, you'll start to get me. And that is, I care more about you than anything that you do. Do you get that? What I mean when I say that? It's not as much a concern to me what we choose to do as a church, so much as you, what happens with you along the way, what happens with your life and the events that are important to you individually. And that if we take care of that, the other stuff will be good. But I don't want to lose sight of that. And I came to kind of thinking about that in such a way that with the preparation of this annual report this year, I went back and read the last 23. So there's some interesting things in there. But here's what I think is the most interesting thing. And I shared this with Martha and Sue yesterday, talking while we were eyeing the cake that's in the kitchen. There seems to me to kind of be a tipping point or a turning point of the church back when the Westridge property was sold. There's nobody to blame for anything. So I don't want anything to feel like anybody's got a certain kind of responsibility with this. But what I noticed, and I think I see, is that prior to that time, maybe a few years before the property was sold, Wayne Dalton wrote in his minister's report that he was so pleased to be able to retire, knowing that the church had gained so much strength and was in such a good place. And then within a year or two of selling the Westridge property, there were the first groups that became concerned about the future of the church. And I thought about that because one of the things that happened with the sale of the Westridge property is, what do we do with the money? What do we do with this asset that we have that's now part of this land, part of our endowment, part of the way we look at our community? and what we do. But I want you to think about this. I still think there's good things for us to do. I'm not against anything that anybody has proposed or anything like that. So I don't want you to take my words the wrong way. But what I want to say is that prior to that time, with way less money, Wayne Dalton felt like the church was strong. And it seemed like all of the activities that the church did were fostering community within the church. The focus was on each other and how we cared for each other. But then after the sale of the property and the money's there, the focus sort of goes outward. That's not a bad thing that it went outward. I think that it's good to think about the ways that we can impact the community and the ways that we can contribute to the world that we live in. But if we forget the other part, then what happens? What happens to us if we stop cultivating that community? I'm a very internally focused person. I like small groups. I like to talk to people individually. I feel that that's part of the ways that you build community is one person at a time. You can't have a goal like that and just jump out and embrace everybody at one time because people don't connect one-on-one. They don't join a group because the group has embraced them. They join a group because one person made a strong connection with them and invited them back, or they felt welcome by that one person or those two people, not by the whole group. At least that's the way I function. It's the way I see how things grow. And I think we need that more than we may have ever needed that before. Because after 2 years in a pandemic, what is the one thing that we're missing the most? Is that interpersonal contact, that interpersonal care. So the cornerstone that's rejected. What is the cornerstone that's rejected? To me, the cornerstone that's rejected is that love and care, meaning that is the cornerstone of everything that we do as a church. That is what Jesus tried to bring by saying that when you reject me or you reject someone like me that has the perspective that I have on the world, where love is important, where our interior life is important, when we don't see that how we relate to each other is the most important thing, then you're rejecting the foundation of what it means to do something in community. And that's the cornerstone, I think, of this church. It is a community of care. It has to be a community of care because we don't all come together because we believe the same thing, because we don't. We know that. We celebrate that we don't believe the same thing. So we have to care. We have to care. And how does that work? It always starts with care for yourself, care for the person closest to you, and it goes out from there. The best way to love another person is to begin to love yourself. It doesn't mean that you have to love yourself only in order to love someone else, but your love for someone else is a little bit incomplete if you don't understand your own self-worth and value. And that self-worth and value is part of who we are. And I believe it's a part of everything that we do. And I hope it's a part of all of the ways that we see each other. So that's my prelude to our meeting today. That I hope that we can work from that kind of place with everything that we say and do. And I think whatever decisions we make will flow into a naturally good place if we can do that. Thank you.